Hello and welcome to the TD Walter Bean High School lecture. Whose activism? Your activism, actions for a most just and sustainable community. My name is Miriam Latifor-Kiportis, and I have the distinct honor to serve the Faculty of Environment as the Director of Advancement at the University of Waterloo. I'd like to begin by publicly acknowledging the land that I'm on. The Waterloo, Kitchener, and Cambridge campuses of the university is situated on the Haldimand Tract, land that was promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River and is a traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people. Our ability to work and live here is completely tied to the policies of expulsion, assimilation, and abuse of Indigenous people during the time of settlement and Confederation and since. As an immigrant and a proud mother, raising a first-generation Canadian, I feel we have a responsibility to acknowledge with respect and understanding the diverse histories and cultures of all Indigenous peoples within our country. And I invite you to acknowledge the traditional territory that you're residing in today. So I want to thank you all for joining us. Would love to know where everyone is joining us from. So please feel free to use the chat and drop in your city and if you feel comfortable, the high school you're joining us from. We also would love for you to share your questions during the Q&A or even throughout the talk using the Q&A button. Our colleagues are going to share that in the background with us, and during the Q&A session, we'll try our best to get to all the questions. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to also encourage the audience to send your questions via Q&A. So use the Q&A channel, and our colleagues will be feeding that to us via chats, and we'll be sharing as many of your questions as possible. So now, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor Julian Agyeman. Julian is a renowned professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University in Greater Boston in the US. And he's the originator of the increasingly influential concept of just sustainability, which explores the intersection of goals of social justice and environment. Julian shared an awe-inspiring, as my son would like to say, super cool public lecture, which can also be found on our YouTube page. So that link will be shared with you virtually. Without further ado, I will now pass it on to our esteemed speaker, Julian. Over to you, Julian.
It's really my pleasure today to help you think as young people through some of the implications of youth activism around some of the most pressing issues that we have today. I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement that I'm presenting on the traditional territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, their past, their present, and their future, and commit to a principle of care as part of this meeting. Yesterday, as I was thinking about my talk, I came across this piece, shocking piece, in the Guardian newspaper, which, as many of you know, the Guardian is, excuse me, a British newspaper, but it's become, like the New York Times, a sort of go-to global newspaper. This is a young Indigenous man, Bryna David Kukuname, who was shot dead whilst protesting Indigenous rights within Colombia in South America. What it made me think of is the bravery of some of these young people that are doing this work and how they put themselves in harm's way for what they believe in. This is an amazing thing. Now, I think back to my activism, and I don't want to tell you when that was, but when I was a young person, the way I got into the environment was through the beauty of nature. I was a bird watcher. I used to look at and identify plants. I got into this through the wonderment of nature. And in many ways, I feel sorry for young people, young activists who come into a love of the environment through a fear of what is going to happen to the environment. So I want you to remember that. Two very different motivations. Many of my generation were just in awe of nature. Later, we became aware of acid rain and climate change, but it was nature that drove us. So I don't want you to think that your activism just has to be around saving the planet. I mean, obviously that's really important, but take a moment as well to love the planet and to love all of the natural wonders, physical, biological, etc. So I'm going to talk about three little stories in a sense, but they're not little, they're big stories. First, I'm going to talk about a group of young people in the Roxbury neighbourhood in Boston, and how they managed to form a coalition called Clean Buses for Boston in response to outrageously high asthma levels in the neighbourhood. I'm then going to talk a little bit about global climate justice activism and really ask the question, why are young girls and women taking the lead in this? And then I'm going to finish up talking a little bit about who grows Canada's food, what stories we're telling about food, and why this matters. So let me start with a shameless plug for one of my books. This was written in 2005, and it's called Sustainable Communities and the Challenge of Environmental Justice. Now, when I looked at this picture again, I thought, well, these days it's not strange to see people wearing masks, but in 1997, when they were campaigning for clean buses, it was strange for people to wear masks. And I think the masks, it says, fresh air, please, this is our neighborhood. These young people took it upon themselves to do something that most adults thought wasn't possible. The guy on the left, David, that was when he was a teenager. He's now on the board of directors of the organization that helps these young people to get clean buses for Boston. But let me set some context. So these kids live in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Boston. It was redlined, and redlining was a process in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, where federal government and banks said, we're not going to lend money to people in these neighborhoods. And you can guess what the characteristics of these neighborhoods were. They were largely immigrants, people of color neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods. So the neighborhoods became disinvested, dumped upon, homes fell into ruin because people couldn't get grants to improve their homes. So that's the context. And along comes an organization called Alternatives for Community and Environment. And they said, you know, we don't want to just do environmental education where kids are just told about the environment. We want to set up a program, and we're going to call it REAP, the Roxbury Environmental Empowerment Program, not education, empowerment. And that's a very important word. And the way that this program operated, the teachers didn't go into schools and say, okay, today we're going to study X. No, they went into schools and said, what are the issues that are affecting you in your neighborhood? And these two kids and other kids at their school said, asthma. Asthma is the big thing. Roxbury, this disadvantaged neighborhood in Boston, has 5 times the asthma rates of other communities in Massachusetts, 5 times the rates. And it's a low-income minority neighborhood. One kid had died, couldn't get his inhaler quickly enough. They got him to hospital, he died. This really galvanized the youth, and they said, look, we're going to do something about this. We want to find out why this happened and what we can do to stop it happening again. Activism. So what they did was they started to look at pollution sources, and they found that there were 14 diesel bus garages, 14 in their neighborhood. They did some research into Massachusetts law, and they found that Massachusetts has an anti-idling law. You must not leave a vehicle idling for more than 5 minutes, or you're breaking the law. So they went to one of these bus garages, one of the biggest, in the middle of summer, and there are about 100 buses in this huge bus garage, and they were all running. They were all idling. The kids timed them 20, 25 minutes, 30 minutes before the bus went off on its rounds. They monitored the pollution. They looked at the levels of pollutants, and they were exceedingly high. They were far above the guidelines set both by federal and state agencies. So they thought, we've got an issue here. And they all organized what was called an anti-idling march. The governor of Massachusetts at the time, Paul Cellucci, who eventually became US ambassador to Canada, Paul Cellucci listened to them, but they wanted more. They went to some organizations and said, we need to form a coalition called Clean Buses for Boston. We need to get these buses, these diesels, these dirty diesels out of our neighborhood, and we think we can do it. So they worked with the Sierra Club, which is a kind of like a very upmarket conservation organization. They worked with the Conservation Law Foundation. They worked with various housing groups. They brought a coalition together. And a coalition is a group of people who have a common goal, clean buses for Boston. They didn't all agree on the way that they should go about this, but they knew that the kids had drive and that they really wanted to help them. So long story short, the coalition pushed for the local transportation authority, the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority. They really pushed hard to get the MBTA to buy 200 compressed natural gas buses and to phase out dirty diesels. The Environmental Protection Agency of the United States fined the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority several $100,000 for idling and for excessive pollution. Come to the present day, we don't have those dirty diesel buses anymore in Boston. And every time I see one of the big yellow MBTA buses, I thank those kids for their activism, their bravery, for their intelligence in looking at the law in Massachusetts, in doing pollution monitoring, and really in bringing this sorry matter to a head. Asthma rates have gone down now in the Roxbury neighbourhood. They're not where they should be, but at least they've gone down. So imagine what these kids have learned in doing this. Imagine the empowerment they feel. And in the case of David on the left, he's now, as I say, on the board of directors of Alternatives for Community and Environment, and he's using that advocacy activism that he learned as a teen to fight for more environmentally just neighborhoods in the Boston area. So I'll come back to that when I come to my summary. But the second piece that I want to talk about is climate justice and climate activism. And we all know the story of this remarkable young Swedish woman, Greta Thornberg. She's sitting there outside the Swedish Ministry of Education calling for a school strike for the climate. She was one of the originators of this idea of school strikes. Maybe some of you have participated. She came to Montreal, Edmonton, Toronto. She had huge crowds. She went to Sydney, Australia, where the biggest ever crowd of over 100,000 people gathered to hear her speak. What a remarkable power this young woman has. She spoke at the United Nations Climate Summit. She used phrases like, "How dare you?" to my generation who are not doing anywhere near enough. "You've stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words." Just read that statement that she put out. So powerful, so eloquent, and so brave. This is bravery, putting yourself out there. She's been attacked by some in the media, by the former president, whose name I'm not going to mention, the former United States president. But what the general opinion is that she's started what's called the Greta Effect. She, in many ways, has emboldened and empowered other young people, especially young women, to really push for changes and massive changes in our climate policies. And of course, as you know, we desperately need those changes. Now, what's remarkable about her as well is that, she did face, she has Asperger's, she faced some mental health issues, and yet, from my reading, what she's found is that campaigning, advocacy for the climate has really helped her work through and work towards better mental health as a result of feeling that she's doing the right thing. And I think we would all agree with that. But, you know, one thing is interesting to me, because I'm very interested in how the media tells these stories. There's many young girls, many young girls, many of them girls of color, whose names weren't heard until we heard of Greta Thunberg. These three girls are, one is Autumn Peltier, who is a Canadian girl who's been made a water commissioner by her local tribal group. Amarina Kopany from Michigan. Some of you will have heard about the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, where the city stopped getting its water, clean water, from Lake Huron and started to get it from the Flint River. And that was polluted. And it was mainly low-income and minority communities that were badly affected by this polluted water. And then Kekeshan Basu from Toronto set up an organization that does global climate, global equity kind of work. So what I want you to remember is when we see these heroes in the media, somebody shows them, and quite rightly Greta is, you know, the leading light among these people. But we mustn't forget the ordinary kids out there who are doing great things. And there are many others. Many, like the first guy that I showed in Colombia, many put their lives on the line and indeed lose their lives as a result of this. But activism, no matter how small, it really needs building coalitions, building community, and giving other people the absolute confidence that they can do these things as well. So when you think about climate activism, don't just think about Greta Thunberg, think about all those other young people, young women from around the world who are doing their part as well. And I think that needs to be absolutely acknowledged. Now, the third thing that I wanted to talk about, because I want to leave plenty of time for us to discuss some of these issues, the third thing is about Canada's food. Now, I'm not going to talk to you about, you know, what percentage comes from big agro businesses and what percentage is locally grown. I want to look at a different story. And this is some research that a student, excuse me, at the University of Toronto did. She wanted to know, what are the stories we're telling about food, about local food? And she went to the Toronto Star and looked at stories about food from the 1980s. And I'm just going to give you the kind of overview. But what she was kind of really interested in was, given that Canada's got a policy on multiculturalism, and it's got this immigrant-friendly rhetoric and promotion of cultural diversity, she was thinking, well, maybe stories about local food are very diverse and reflecting of this multiculturalism. But she found that that wasn't actually the case. She said, I argue that the absences in this rhetoric, this debate, if you like, are the most telling. She didn't find many or any Indigenous perspectives. She found that the stories being told were not balanced in terms of who holds the power in Canadian farms. And she found that inequality was perpetuated through these articles, promoting a sort of Canadian nationalistic ideal that is not inclusive, but exclusionary. Let's take a look a little bit closer. So what she found was that when the story was a kind of good news story about a farmer doing something, in this case, compost can create more contented cows, she found that the storyteller, or the focus of the story, was always a white farmer. But in the articles, it never said he's a white farmer, because you can see that by looking at him. But what I'm going to go on to describe is how some of the other farmers or farm workers were described. And so the argument that the person who wrote this piece that I'm talking to you about, the argument she's making is that we portray the Canadian farmer like we portray the American farmer as sort of a steward, a white steward of the land, but we never remark about their race or ethnicity. The idea of farms as multi-generational enterprises is given through this lens of whiteness, that these are the original families, these are the original people that farmed the land. There is no mention of Indigenous farming. And, you know, the Toronto Star is not a right-wing paper. This is I believe, a centre-left paper. Why these omissions? Why are we constructing a story that isn't necessarily true? And why is it that when we talk about immigrant farmers, we use words like exotic Asian offering tastes woodsy and sweet. We talk about the farmer in Brampton growing callaloo, which is very popular with people of Caribbean origin. And the comment that the author makes, she said, it could appear that any representation of immigrants as farmers is automatically positive. I mean, it looks good. We want to see a diverse farming community. But she says the very act of emphasizing and naming their cultural difference, their newness, their exotic tastes and cuisines implies that there is an unnamed norm, a normalizing thing from which they differ. So when we looked at this farmer, we didn't talk about his ethnicity. He was just assumed to be a white Canadian and part of this multi-generational farming ideal that is prevalent in Canada and in the United States. But here, we are told about the ethnicity of the farmers. Why is that? Why would we do that? And even worse was an article called United Colours of Berrydom. At a distance, you can tell the migrants from the immigrants on Bert Andrews' farms by their headwear. Fuchsia turbans and mustard-coloured scarves mean Sikhs from Brampton. Dark baseball caps mean Mexicans. Why is it that we're okay talking in this way about immigrant or farmers of colour when we don't talk in the same way about the white farmers, the yeoman farmers, the farmers who have, in theory, as this account would have us believe, have been the mainstay, the backbone. Now, many of you might know as well that hundreds of thousands of farm workers come to Canada every year from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, as part of the seasonal worker agricultural program. They're not allowed to apply for citizenship as a result of being on that program. So the story I want you to see here is food is really important to us. We know that. Food is not just important as a physiological need. I mean, that's important. You know, we need food to survive. But food is much more about a celebration. Food, if you think about your own culture, there are certain times in the year when we eat certain foods. So we all eat food. Why don't we portray the growers of that food in a fairer light, in a light that doesn't make it seem strange that there will be Sikh farmers? I could imagine this article could have been written very differently, but why did the author choose to sensationalize the baseball caps mean Mexicans and the turbans mean Sikhs? So again, you know, you might be thinking, well, what's he talking about here? I thought we were going to be listening about activism. This is really important. Food activism, I think, if you are going to become a food activist, you have to think about how do we portray the different cultures and cuisines of Canada? How do we celebrate them rather than making them sensationalized and whiteness and the white farmer being the norm? So what can we draw from this very short presentation? What can we draw? I think we can say that young people are at the heart and the soul of activism from local to global scales. I think we can say that activism cuts across racial and ethnic groups. So many of the examples that I've given you here are activists of color, white activists. We need activism across our socioeconomic, racial, and ethnic groups. That's really important, because I think certainly for activists of color, to see another activist of color gives you confidence. Think about how the Williams sisters in tennis changed US tennis. So many young girls, Black girls, saw these people and they said, we can do that. So I think we need activism that cuts across these racial and ethnic groups, because they become exemplars of, hey, my culture, my community is doing this. We need to get on board. Young women and girls are taking leadership roles. Now, there's a whole range of possible reasons, and I want to discuss some of them with you in our Q&A session. But it pleases me to see that young women and girls are taking these leadership roles, not only in environmental activism, but you think of Malala Yousafzai and her bravery in speaking her truth and the results of that. I think also we can conclude that youth activism can and does bring adults on board. It makes adults proud. I mean, my generation, we have to hand over the reins to younger generations. But that doesn't mean to say we just hand over the reins and don't do anything. I think we can use our wisdom, power, experience to help youth activists to envision the new futures that they see. And I think finally, again, this idea that the media can use these tropes, these memes that center whiteness as the norm, while rendering the other, the Sikhs in Brampton, the Mexicans with baseball caps, rendering them exotic. That's got to stop. We have to tell stories of people doing good work, rather than they are Mexican and doing good work, or they're Sikh and doing good work. So I'm going to stop there. And what I want to do now is to take questions. I understand that some of you have been putting some in the chat, and I think Mariam is going to be the moderator for this. Is that right, Mariam?
Yes, thank you. That was really inspiring, Julian. And I wanted to just invite everybody first to put their questions in the Q&A section. I know some questions have been shared in advance as well. Maybe what I can do is start with one of the earlier questions. So why does, or maybe perhaps, how does global climate change affect our food supply, Julian?
Well, that's a great question. Global climate change is going to affect our food supply in many, many, many ways. And remember, with a lot of these sort of issues, there are winners and losers. A winner will be the wheat belts of Russia. The wheat belts of Russia will grow larger. Russia will be able to grow more wheat, whereas in the Gulf of Maine, which is part of, from where I am in Boston, right up to the Canadian Maritimes, the Gulf of Maine is experiencing temperature changes, which is affecting lobster breeding. So you can think of an iconic species like lobster to Boston, or perhaps to Halifax, Nova Scotia. We're going to experience lower lobster harvests. How do you take the lobster out of New England? That's going to be very strange. So, it's going to be a mixture of pluses and minuses in terms of how global food supply is impacted. But I think one thing that we all know for definite is that it is mainly those in the poorest countries that are going to be hit first and worst. So you think of expansion of the Sahara Desert and the impact on those countries that are in the Sahara and on the edge of the Sahara. Agricultural production is going to be greatly impacted, and that will then result in these, what we're calling environmental refugees or climate refugees, who are going to the North African coast, getting in boats and trying to get to Europe. And then, they get into France and they go over to the UK. So we are experiencing a migration crisis at the moment. it is nothing compared to what we will experience as climate change takes greater hold.
And so, you know, a lot of our students that come to the Faculty of Environment, they're very passionate about the environment. A lot of students who come to Waterloo are very passionate about making and impacting change through technology or innovation. And I know perhaps a lot of the students that are in this chat have the same passion. That's why they've joined today. What are some tangible ways that students can really mobilize the change? We know climate change is real, but what are some of the tangible ways that we as community members, but also specifically students, can mobilize change?
Well, climate activism on campus is really big. You can get your universities to divest from fossil fuels. Some universities have done it. And I think, you know, it's like, you know, a snowball. Once several big institutions divest from fossil fuels, others will do the same. Personally, I've divested my pension funds from fossil fuels because I felt that as a critic of my own institution, Tufts, for not divesting, I thought, you know, I'd better get clean. Get your faculty to change their pension plans from ones that they don't know where the money is invested into ones where they do. And my funds are now managed by an organization called Progressive Investors Network Boston, and it's all in clean, non-alcohol, non-tobacco, non-coal, clean funds, biotech, and that kind of thing. So students, I think students, faculty, alumni, because, you know, here in the US, we have a bigger tradition of alumni giving. Some alumni make lots of money and they give a lot of money. And one idea that our students have been talking to the alumni about is, why don't the alumni stop giving, put the money into an account, the money that they would have given, grow it, and then when the university divests, say, yes, okay, you can have the money that we would have given you. So I think campus activism, university-based activism is really important. I mean, you imagine if the billions that universities invest in fossil fuel-based investments, and the billions or trillions that are invested for faculty in their pension funds, that would make a huge difference. So come on, students, let's get active. Let's get the alumni involved. Let's get the faculty to change their pension plans, and let's get universities out of fossil fuels. I mean, any university, I mean, if you read about University of Waterloo and you're the biggest faculty of the environment in Canada, I think, you should be leading. This should be your big lead. And one final thing on this, when I was a student in the 1970s, the big thing wasn't climate change, it was apartheid. We were trying to topple the apartheid regime in South Africa. And we knew in the UK, where I was a student, that Barclays Bank was the biggest institutional investor. So we mobilized, we got students to take their grants out of Barclays Bank, put them into other banks. And eventually that toppled the regime, because Barclays eventually pulled out of South Africa. And that was the beginning of the end, when the biggest financial institution in South Africa said, the game's up, the game's up. So this climate change, climate justice issue is your anti-apartheid moment. This is your moment, and you need to seize it right now and make change.
Thank you, Julian. I think this is from perhaps this teacher, but the next question is, what initiatives do you think that schools should take to become more eco-friendly?
Well, yeah, there's many things you can do, but I don't want you to just become more eco-friendly. There's a danger that we think about environment just as, oh, you know, we need a nature garden with native plants in there. We need to have, we need to lower the level of energy consumption. Yes, these are all important, but you know, one of the things that I think about in terms of sustainability is we could legislate for a green world, but if it wasn't socially just, would it really be sustainable? I think when you think about an eco-friendly school, think about a just and eco-friendly school. Let me give you an example. So many schools, universities have sustainability indicators. We do at Tufts. We've had them 20-something years. And I looked at them with one of my classes, and they were all about wasting less food in the university canteens, using less water, using less electricity. That's good. But also on campuses, we're having hate crimes. Is it sustainable that we have hate crimes? That's part of a sustainable campus, to not have hate crimes. We're having sexual violence. That's not sustainable. So when you think about your school's eco push, if you think, then you should think about it not just in terms of greening the school, but making the school more healthy and socially just as well. So that's one thing I definitely would think about. Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question is from Nick, who asked, how should we fight for food sovereignty in many contexts around the world, for example, in Uganda?
Right. Okay. Food sovereignty is a very interesting issue. Look, let's think about food activism. I mean, at the emergency level, we have food banks and food pantries, and you know, it's sad that we need these places, but we do. These are part of what we call food security, making sure that nobody dies for the lack of food. The next level of activism is what's called food justice. And that's what I kind of research quite a lot. And that says everybody should have access in their local food system to culturally appropriate, nutritious food that is grown in a way that respects both the environment and those poor farm workers that I talked about who are paid minimal wage here in the US. I think it's a little bit better in Canada. And then the top level of activism is for food sovereignty. We want to control the land on which our food is grown. And this started with an organization in South America called La Via Campesina, the way of the peasant, if you like. And I can see it being easier to do that kind of thing in countries other than, say, Canada and the United States, although, you know, the idea of food sovereignty is very prevalent in the United States and has been linked with indigenous struggles, has been linked to ideas of cooperative agriculture, rather than making money from food, just making enough to keep the farm going so that people can eat well at an affordable rate. So the goal, yes, absolutely should be food sovereignty, but I, at the moment, would settle for food justice on the route to going towards food sovereignty, but it was a great question.
And, you know, it's interesting because I've always loved growing my own vegetables and food. I started, you know, in where I grew up, not Canada, learning about the land and the soil. I noticed when COVID started, everyone wanted to start growing their own fruits and vegetables. And then there was a shortage of soil and shortage of seeds and this mad rush of, you know, trying to grow our own food. How important do you think it is for us, just regardless of age, but most importantly as high school students, to learn about growing food and potentially understanding how we can create these smaller garden communities and communities of growing local food?
I think it's really important. I mean, any contact with the natural world is really important. I mean, it's been shown that, in fact, one guy wrote a book about nature deficit disorder. You know, we talk about attention deficit disorder. Well, nature deficit disorder. I mean, I know personally that, you know, if I don't get out into the countryside, go to the mountains, you know, I'm a different person. much less stressed. I'm much more stressed if I don't get an opportunity to go to nature. So I think community gardens, home gardens, these are really important spaces where we not only grow things that we know about, but we learn from others. They are intercultural learning spaces. They are spaces where those Sikhs from Brampton can talk to the Mexicans and learn about their cultures. So urban agriculture, food growing, is one of the best ways of bringing groups together. And as you know, we're separating as societies. We need to find things that are relatively neutral, like food, because we all need to eat, we're humans. But then across the fence or across the lots or the plots that we have, we can tell stories about food and introduce other people to our cultures. So they are fantastic intercultural learning resources.
I can agree more. The number of family members and high school kids in our family that have started to grow food even better than I have, who've been doing things, is remarkable. Now, Moses, one of our guests, writes Nairobi, and this is a mind opener for him. He relates with a recent storm in Kenya where global KFC food chain ran out of imported potatoes. I don't know why you would import potatoes when you make them there, but because they ran out, they decided to buy from local farmers. Kenya is still feeling from the effects of colonialism. What is your take on this?
Well, I was going to mention another story, a very interesting story. The supermarket giant in the UK, Tesco, used to have a relationship with market gardeners in Kenya to grow cut flowers. And then about 15 years ago, maybe 20, Tesco said, we're going local. We're going to source our stuff locally. And, you know, and nobody would disagree with that. That's good. Invest in local ecosystems. But to the colonial point that our questioner is asking, Tesco set up these relationships with the market gardeners in and around Nairobi and throughout Kenya. How can you then say, sorry, we're out of here? That's morally wrong. And it underlies that colonial attitude that, you know, we will take from you when we need, and then when we don't need it from you, we will drop you. Now, I don't know what actually happened in the end, and maybe our questioner does, but yes, I mean, you know, agriculture in many parts of the world still follows colonialist ideals. Agriculture in many parts of the world still follows the ideals of economic restructuring. So, you know, a country gets into bad debt, goes to the IMF or the World Bank and says, you know, we need to restructure our debt. So what's the first thing that happens? Agricultural specialists go to the country and say, okay, you can stop growing that food for local people. We want you to grow this for export, and you can make lots of money from it. And so these poor countries that can barely feed their own people then start producing for export. Again, this colonialist mindset that you are only as good as what you provide for the global north. But great question. Is it Daniel, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Great question.
Oh, sorry, Moses from, I'm sorry, from Nairobi. I apologize.
Okay, Moses.
So at this point, again, if our audience have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. I'm curious to know, Julian, you've had a very interesting journey in terms of your own education, academia. You talked about being really in love with nature and that drawing you to go out in nature and experience, you know, identifying plants and really enjoying that experience. How did you decide what field to go to? Because I mean, I'm sure a lot of the students, high school students that are joining, you know, many will probably know where they want to go. Some are undecided or they don't know. So can you talk a bit about your own journey as an example of how you weaved through various different experiences to get to where you are?
Sure, yeah. Well, as I say, I was always passionate about the environment, nature as a kid. So when I went to university to do my undergraduate degree, I did a bachelor's degree in geography and botany. People don't study botany these days. They call it environmental science, geography and botany. But really, that gave me the science about nature, and that was really important. And then I worked for a few years. I taught high school geography and environmental science. And then I wanted to do a master's degree. And at the time, there were only 2 master's degrees in the UK that were conservation based. One was more about the science of conservation. And I thought, well, I know that because I've done my, I've done all the science stuff. But there's this other one about the social science of conservation, starting from the point about conservation, about who gets to say what should be conserved? Who gets to shape the policies and plans of the future? How do we get people in neighborhoods to get up and say, you know what, we need more green space in our neighborhood and we're going to get active? How do we get people to switch off the TV and say, we want to get a green space, or we want to slow the cars down on our street because, kids are scared to cross the road? So I really then got into more the policy side of of conservation. Then I did a PhD in urban studies, and now I'm a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning. I always wanted to have impact. And I think that's what you should think about is, how do you personally have impact? How can you use your passions, your values to make this world a better place? And I feel blessed that for the last 25 years, I've been working with graduate students, and you know what? It keeps you young working with young people, being immersed in these ideas, these passions, these progressive values, because we know the science of sustainability. We can have a sustainable world. That's not the problem. It's the politics and public attitudes. That's the social science problem. And that's why I'm in social science. Every science, we've known for the last 30 years how to make cars run much more efficiently on tiny amounts of fuel. The reason we don't have them doing that is certainly here in the US because of the lobbies by the motor industry. So we have the science of sustainability, but what we don't have is the social science, which is the politics, the policy, planning, and the public attitudes. And so if you want to make impact, think about getting into public policy and planning.
Thank you. And I know many of our students who come to our planning program, to come to our geography, even knowledge integration and, environment and business or environment research studies, they bring that passion and drive. And many of them have gone and done activism. But a question that Nick James puts in the chat is, what's the difference between activism and social movement?
Great question. No, a really good question. And the two are related. Social movements are movements like the environmental movement, the climate movement, the conservation movement, the biodiversity movement, the indigenous rights movement. All of these are social movements. And what they do is they use activism as a tool. Community building, power mapping, all the different tools that you can use to become sort of activists. So in simple answer to your question, the social movement is the group of people, and activism is a set of processes by which we demand and hopefully get change.
Very well said. I'm looking at the time, and I wish we had more time to keep going, but at this time, if anyone has any more questions, I invite you to just put that in. I have a couple of more questions here that I'm going to put forward, but I think we may have time for one or two more. Usually in these things at the 11th hour, all the questions come in, and we want to get to all of your questions as much as possible. So one of the questions is that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown how fragile our food system is. how fragile a lot of things are, but definitely our food system. How has it impacted racialized communities, and how can youth activism be used to address this?
Another great question. Yeah, look, COVID, certainly speaking from the US, which, I have more experience of these days, COVID unveiled the deep inequalities that we knew were present in our society. And I can't dissociate COVID as well from the murder of George Floyd in May 2020. Now, the two weren't related, but they are now, because what COVID has done is made us understand the inequalities better. But the moment that 9.5 minutes of video that we watched, and I wish I hadn't had to watch, that's changed America. A lot of people came off the fence. A lot of people said, I'll give the police the benefit of the doubt. But not after George Floyd. There's been a huge movement for more accountability. So I think that, and issues related to our food supply, and the fact that more COVID deaths have happened in minority and lower income communities, has really again just shown us that inequality is one of the defining issues in our society at the moment. And quite honestly, to your question, how can we become active? Activism around inequality is really important. The Boston Globe, my local major newspaper, did a survey in 2020, and they found that the net worth, which is where you take your debts away from your assets, like your home, the net worth of the average African-American family in Boston is $8. The average net worth of a white family is $247,000. There's something wrong with that picture, something deeply wrong. Are Black families so much more lazy that they haven't managed to accrue? No, we have to look at the structures that keep inequality alive. And so a very good form of activism would be in justice-related organizations. And this is why now we don't talk about climate change, we talk about climate justice. We don't talk about environmental issues, we talk about environmental justice. We don't talk about food, we talk about food justice. Because when you look at the maldistribution, the inequalities of food access, they are all related to structures in our society that prevent some people getting nutritious food. I mean, I haven't even mentioned food deserts. You have them in Canada. We have huge food deserts here in the United States. And it wouldn't surprise you if I told you that where those kids were active on asthma issues in Roxbury, that's a food desert. So there's a word, and I know we're coming up towards the end. Intersectionality is the word I want to leave you with. All of these issues are related. It might not seem like food, climate, inequality are related, but believe me, they are. And the more experience and wisdom I get on these issues, the more I realize, yes, we can campaign on food issues, but we must be able to see the bigger picture, that what we're actually campaigning on is, or campaigning for, is access and to lower inequality.
And that is a really good way for us to kind of go to the last thing that I wanted to just mention and just get your reaction. One of the favorite quotes that I have is, education is the most powerful weapon which can use it to change the world. And that's by Nelson Mandela. I just want to get your reaction to that as a professor, but also as someone who has used education to.
Can you say that quote again? Sorry.
Sure, of course. The quote is, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world.
Absolutely. Look, as a young mixed race kid growing up in, well, I was born in 1958, go figure. So I grew up in the 60s and 70s in the UK. I went to an all-white school. Me and my brother were the only Black kids, and then there was one Asian kid in our school. I knew that education was the way to have a better life. My grandparents, my English grandparents and my mother believed in that as well. And I've never looked back. So education is, I think, a way to a form of personal freedom to make choices about what kind of activist you want to be, because we must be activists. We cannot sit on the sidelines. I mean, you're all activists in some way. You're advocating and pushing for changes. You know, I want to use a moment here to introduce you to the thinking of the great economist, the Indian economist, Amartya Sen. He said that famine doesn't occur because of lack of food, it occurs because of lack of democracy. And you look around the world where famine is happening, there's often great big food stores very close by, but the food is not getting to the right people because there's a lack of democracy. Famine isn't caused by lack of food, it's caused by a lack of democracy. Democracy, education, these are things that we need to defend and enhance people's capabilities to make change. I mean, I feel completely privileged that I'm in a position in my life now where I can A, mentor younger people, and B, I can actually really make change. Things that I've suggested to policymakers have happened and have done good things. That's more than, you know, a life's work in many ways, to be able to feel that you're privileged to be able to make change. Don't just go and make bling and money, make change.
Thank you, Julian. Those are really inspiring words. With that, just wanted to, I love Moses. This talk is great, just too short. My apologies. You know, we are so privileged to have great friends and partners like Julian. And we really hope that you can join us in future for other events. We hope that we can have Julian come to Canada, come to Waterloo for a visit and meet with our students, and hopefully in the future have other wonderful discussions with them. Thank you so much for the privilege to have the opportunity to chat with you. Thank you to our guests. Wishing you safe and wonderful week ahead. And please feel free to come back and share your thoughts with us. And thank you again for joining us. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.